Most new B2B podcasts default to a guest interview format. Why? Because it feels safe. But safe podcasts rarely change anything. And in fact, your guests are probably ruining your podcast. Almost every B2B podcast starts the same way. Not with a strategy, not with a question about the outcomes, not with discussion around the transformation for the listener, but with this question.
Welcome to B2B Podcasting Insights with Neal Veglio, founder of Podknows, a podcast agency helping you get better results from podcasting.
Right, team, we're going to start this B2B podcast. So which guests do we need to book?
And that decision usually gets made before anyone has stopped to ask what the podcast is actually meant to do. Look, interviews are not necessarily bad, but relying on them by default is where most branded podcasts are failing. Interviews feel like the obvious choice because they're familiar. Every business podcast you listen to tends to feature an interview, but they spread responsibility and they borrow in the credibility. They let the host hide a little bit. If the episode doesn't land, it wasn't on you. It's always defended as, it was just one of those conversations. And internally, interviews tend to be politically safe. There's never a strong point of view, there are never any hard lines, and there's no risk of sounding too opinionated. It's just two people having a relatively pedestrian pleasant chat, which is exactly the problem. I mean, if you look at the business charts right now, they are full of interview shows. It's usually someone who fancies themselves as something of an influencer chatting to founders. And most of them are frankly terrible. Not because the guests aren't impressive, they usually are, but it's because the interviews are completely self-serving. They're structured around, tell us what you've done, tell us how amazing that was for you, and tell us why you're so successful. So it creates this sealed bubble where two important people are talking at each other. And you, the listener, you're just there to provide them with the download. There's no attempt to bridge the gap between, this is what I did, and this is what you should probably try next. So there's no accountability. There's no translation. There's no connection to real life. It's just ego dressed up as insight. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most interview-led B2B podcasts are far more interested in looking credible, being associated with impressive people, and propping up their own sense of self-importance than they actually are in helping their listener get from where they currently are to where they'd really love to be. And the listener can feel that. They can tap into that energy. They're absolutely not stupid. They know when a conversation exists for them and when it exists for the host's LinkedIn engagement. And that's why so many of these branded shows get downloads, but no impact. So, okay, let's be fair about this. Let's have balance and talk about what interviews are actually good at. To be clear, interviews can work. They are good when there's a strong host point of view already in place and they're wanting to be challenged. So the guest is there to test an idea, not decorate the episode in fake insight. And the conversation, if it's framed around the listener's situation, that can be good. Interviews should always serve the wider strategy, but they should never be the strategy. When I'm chatting to potential podcast clients, I am usually pushing them away from relying on interviews. And the resistance is almost always the same. It's not technical. They've got the ability to do it. It's psychological. It's that dreaded imposter syndrome. Founders are assuming in their own brains, why would anyone want to listen to me talk for 20 minutes? So they hide behind guests. And that's when I stop speculating and nagging them and actually show them the data. Because this isn't guesswork. When we compare interview episodes on other podcasts versus solo episodes, and engagement versus completion rates, and responses versus silence, the difference is always obvious. Solo episodes always outperform, particularly on shows where they've been relying entirely on organic up till then. And it's not now and then, it's consistent. And once they see that, something shifts. They realize they're not being egotistical by being a solo host. They're actually being accountable. The biggest advantage of solo or non-interview episodes isn't about control. It's clarity. When you speak directly to your listener, you can actually say, this is where you are. This is where you want to get to. And this thing in the middle, ignore that. It's nonsense. But you can't do that in a guest conversation without constantly interrupting or steering. Well, I really loved your point about that, but that's not what we're here for. Can we get back onto this point, please? You never hear that in a podcast episode, do you? No, because it doesn't exist. Solo episodes let you guide your listener from A to B with no third party getting in the way. It helps you remove distractions and build that belief step by step. And more crucially, the listener knows exactly who they're trusting. There's none of that trust me bro guest energy. There's no mystery authority. It's just lived experience, and it's fully owned by accountable people, namely the host. And here's what actually happens when a B2B podcast stops hiding behind guests. They get longer listening times. They get higher engagement. And weirdly enough, they get more inbound messages referencing specific episodes. People don't really ever say, I loved your guest. They say, I loved your episode about X. So the host becomes the authority, not the curator of other authority figures. And let's be honest, there's another benefit that people rarely think about. You stop risking your trust. One bad guest can undo months of careful positioning. Solo episodes don't dilute your brand. They concentrate it. Because let's be honest, we need to talk about the real job of a B2B podcast. I mean, we did do an episode not that long ago about, does your podcast have a job? So let's get back to that. You are not there for your guest. You are there for your customer. And if your customer doesn't feel like the most important person in the conversation, then trust erodes quickly. That's why most interview-first B2B podcasts feel busy but ineffective. They might sound good, they might look good, but they do very little. So look, interviews aren't the problem, but using them by default is. If your podcast has a job to do, namely shortening sales cycles, building belief in your brand, creating alignment, well, it needs a voice before it needs guests. Otherwise, you're just hosting conversations. And conversations don't move businesses forward. The conversation comes later when you've got them on a Zoom call. And we don't all need to hear that conversation.
It's time for questions from listeners. Email with your question, neal@podknows.co.uk.
And thank you to Sarah in Bristol who sent this one. Hi Neal, I wanted to say thanks for the episode about recording less often. I listened to it on the train into London last week for a meeting, and honestly, felt my shoulders drop halfway through. I've been running a solo podcast alongside my freelance work, and I managed to convince myself that missing a week meant I wasn't taking it seriously enough. The guilt was starting to outweigh the joy of producing, which felt kind of backwards. Hearing you talk about choosing intention over frequency gave me permission to rethink the schedule without feeling like I was failing at podcasting, and I've decided to move it to fortnightly for now, and I already feel better about the next episode. Appreciate you saying the things that most podcasting experts don't. Yours, Sarah. Well, Sarah, I'm glad that you found that episode useful, and you're absolutely right. If doing it weekly is too much, and it's adding to your feeling of guilt and shame around not keeping up that consistent cadence, then definitely dropping down the cadence and frequency to a lower rate is a great idea. But also what might help you is thinking ahead and maybe jotting down some ideas for some episodes that you can start drafting. Maybe work on 3 episodes in draft format to begin with, so that by the time it comes to the recording, you've already got half the work done. And then it's a case of just sitting down, committing to a block of maybe an hour or maybe even longer and getting those episodes recorded. That way, your fortnightly episodes could be covered off for a whole year within a much shorter space of time. But thanks for listening, and if there's somebody else that you think might benefit from that episode, please do share it with them.
And now, Founder FAQs.
For this week's Founder FAQs, I want to talk about a conversation I had with Helen, who is the CMO at a mid-market SaaS in the UK. And what Helen asked was, how long should we realistically expect our B2B podcast to take before it delivers anything meaningful for the business? And what I told Helen, I will share with you. Longer than most teams are comfortable admitting, and shorter than people think once it's done properly. See, a B2B podcast isn't a campaign, and that's what many CMOs are used to. They're used to data on a sheet, start date, end date, and results in the next column. And it's not a performance channel in the very early stages. Its first job is to change how people understand you, not to drive immediate business. That usually shows up subtly. Sales conversations getting easier, prospects referencing ideas from your show, fewer basic questions during the sales calls. Some of those things start to happen very quickly, maybe after a few weeks, a few episodes. But if you're measuring success purely in downloads to conversions after just a few episodes, you're going to miss the real signals entirely. The teams who see results fastest are the ones who treat the podcast as a part of the wider buying journey, not a standalone marketing asset. The podcast really helps and reinforces it's not a miracle worker. If you're expecting instant attribution, podcasting is probably going to frustrate you because it just isn't really there yet, not until much deeper in the game. If you're building long-term trust, it definitely becomes one of the most efficient and effective things you can do. Way more than your email list, actually, and way more than a YouTube channel or social media. Now, whether or not that was the answer that Helen wanted, that was the one that I gave her, and thankfully she's been able to go back to her marketing team now and re-strategize the whole approach to the podcast. Well, thanks again for listening to another episode of B2B Podcasting Insights, and if any of this made you rethink how your podcast works for the business, don't rush to fix it. Just notice what felt uncomfortable, and that's usually where the real work starts. And if you want a real, clear, honest view on whether your podcast is actually doing its job, you know where to find me. The link is in the episode description. If you haven't yet, make sure you click the subscribe button below. And if you know of anybody that would find this episode useful, maybe they're another founder or somebody that works within the marketing team at a brand, please do forward this episode on to them so they also can benefit from some B2B podcasting insights.